Since you're the CEO of the Committee to Protect Journalists, can you provide us an overview of global press freedom today and how worrying is it right now?
Well, unfortunately, this moment is the most dangerous time to be a journalist, certainly in the 40 years that the Committee to Protect Journalists has been working. More journalists were killed last year than have ever been killed in the 3 decades that we've been doing documentation on such killings. Journalists are being arrested in record numbers. Journalists are being harassed in record numbers. And so being a journalist is more precarious, more dangerous, more difficult than ever. And of course, it's a time when we need journalism. We need fact-based information more than ever because we're being flooded with lies and misinformation and disinformation.
It's interesting how you mentioned that right now, it's the most dangerous time to be a journalist. Is there a specific region that is most worrying right now?
The reason it's the deadliest time to be a journalist is, of course, because of the conflict in Gaza, because of the number of journalists killed by Israel since October the 7th, many of them deliberately targeted. And of course, journalists are civilians. They must never be targeted in war. And that is the most dangerous place to be a journalist, is Gaza. But it's not only in war zones that journalists are at risk. Journalists are increasingly at risk in places that are not at war, not in conflict zones. They're being targeted and attacked covering political rallies, for example, and political protests. They're being demeaned and degraded by politicians, those in power. They're being harassed online. So it used to be the case that journalists were most under threat and press freedom was most under threat in authoritarian regimes. And sadly, that is no longer the case. Journalists in democracies, including here in Thailand, are increasingly at risk.
Right, and what issues have been contributing to a huge decline in press freedom, whether it's in the US, in Asia, or in other countries around the world?
Well, there are a number of factors. So one is the decline that we're seeing generally in democracy and democratic norms. Journalists are often the first people, if not the first people, to be attacked when democracies decline. And that's obvious if you think about it, because if you are a would-be autocrat, if you want to control the political narrative, the best way to do it is to go after the journalists. We saw this, for example, in Hungary with Viktor Orban, going after those who are reporting the truth, reporting facts that you don't agree with. Those are the people that you go after when you're seeking to control the narrative. So the first reason, and one of the most pressing reasons, is this attack that we've seen from the very top, from leaders including Donald Trump in the United States, who's called journalists enemies of the people, in order to make ordinary people doubt the trustworthiness of journalists. And then, of course, that follows through. You see not only journalists harassed by those in positions of power, but then harassed online by ordinary people and physically attacked. And of course, once you've created the conditions in which people think journalists are not only untrustworthy, but potentially criminal, potentially even threats to national security, you create the conditions in which it's much easier for them to be actually criminalized, as we've seen with people like Maria Ressa in the Philippines, for example.
Right, and since you just mentioned US President Donald Trump criticizing the media, journalists, and have started cutting funds for public media, so why does journalism seem to be much more vulnerable, even in countries like the US, where many people would have this perception that it's supposed to be a free country?
Well, it's a free country, and the United States has always prided itself on having the First Amendment, which protects the press. We have seen a concerted effort by Donald Trump since his first administration to discredit the press, to discredit those reporting critically on him. Now, in this second term, we've seen him move from just simply smearing the press to legal threats against the press, to increased regulation from his administration against the kinds of organizations and institutions that he doesn't like. We've seen big legal challenges against institutions like ABC, the New York Times, and others. And what, of course, makes journalists increasingly vulnerable in this moment is that we've seen a huge decline in the kind of financial model that used to support journalism. So we're all working with fewer resources and a much more precarious situation. And if you have spent a long period of time creating an environment in which journalists are considered to be untrustworthy, you also don't have the public support. And so that all of those things make journalists and media institutions much more vulnerable, including, unfortunately, in places like the United States.
So how journalists in the US are struggling through this crisis?
Well, many journalists are struggling because it's very new to them. This is not an experience they've had before. They're struggling to see how you can both cover the current administration but also be critical of it. Many times we've seen journalists struggling to work out how you defend journalists in the moment. An example is the number of times that Donald Trump has openly criticized particularly female journalists. You may remember earlier this year he said to one journalist, one female reporter from Bloomberg, who asked him a question, his response was, "Quiet, piggy." He frequently tells journalists, including CNN journalist Caitlin Collins, to smile. And what we often see is those kinds of very obvious misogynistic outbursts towards female journalists are met with silence from colleagues. And so I think journalists are really struggling to work out how to speak out publicly in this moment, both in the moment, but also generally about press freedom. And of course, many journalists are very, very worried about their own status in places like the United States, which has cracked down hugely on immigration. Journalists who are not American citizens are worried about being potentially evicted for writing critical articles. We know of journalists who are asking for their bylines to be taken off, particularly student journalists, because they fear that there might be retaliation from the government. So many journalists in this moment, I think, are struggling with how to meet the moment, but also continue to do their jobs effectively.
Looking ahead, what gives you so much optimism about the future of journalism?
I'm optimistic because no matter the threats, we continue to see people coming into this profession. We continue to see people, young people, moving into this profession. We've seen people who are willing to report and go on even the front lines because they know how important information is. They know how important it is to have access to truthful, fact-based information. And so what makes me hopeful is that people continue to do that because they know how important it is. And that's very exciting.